The desert at 3:40 in the morning does not welcome you. It tolerates you. It sits in absolute silence, watching with the patience of something that existed long before you arrived and will continue long after you are gone, waiting for the moment you make a mistake. The temperature had dropped to 41 degrees by the time Staff Sergeant Avery Drummond settled into her position behind the rock formation, and the cold came up through the ground like something deliberate pressing into her ribs, her elbows, the bones of her knees. She did not move. She had not moved in 40 minutes. Her Barrett M82 rested on its bipod pointed southeast, the barrel covered by the ghillie netting she had arranged before the SEAL team arrived. The rifle weighed 29 pounds. She knew every ounce of it, the way a pianist knows the resistance of keys, the way a surgeon knows the tension of a blade before it gives. The Barrett was not a weapon to Avery Drummond. It was a mathematical instrument. It translated calculation into consequence. It took everything she understood about the physical world and made it precise. She was 24 years old. The SEAL team had established their positions 200 meters to her left, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this in a dozen countries across a decade and a half of continuous war. 8 operators, veterans of Fallujah, Kandahar, in a handful of places that appeared on no map available to the public. They had looked at her once when she arrived at the staging area 4 hours earlier, a single collective assessment, and then they had returned to their equipment checks. In their world, she was a question mark attached to a rifle case. She had not attempted to answer the question. She had simply moved to her position and begun working. Commander Seth Rourke had not looked away as quickly as his men. He was 44 years old, built like someone who had never permitted himself to stop being a soldier, with gray threading through the hair above his ears and eyes that held the particular quality of stillness that accumulates only through years of witnessing difficult things at close range. 16 years with the teams, 3 Bronze Stars, a service record that read like a geographic catalog of America's recent conflicts. He had stood at the vehicle and watched Avery walk across the gravel, and his expression had not changed, but the set of his jaw had tightened in a way that Chief Brendan Holt, standing beside him, recognized immediately. Rourke had questions. He always had questions. It was precisely this that had kept him and the men under his command alive. The orders had come directly from Admiral Gerald Pace at Naval Special Warfare Command. Not a request, a directive. One Army Staff Sergeant Specialty, unspecified, designated as primary long-range observation specialist for a classified reconnaissance operation in the Nevada Training Corridor adjacent to a restricted operational area. No explanation accompanied the directive, no context. Only a name and Admiral Pace's signature at the bottom, and both of those things together implied more than either did alone. Rourke had pulled her file immediately. It was thin in a way that was not absence, but removal. Someone had extracted everything interesting and left just enough to satisfy a surface inquiry. Standard Army sniper qualifications, 3 listed deployments. Nothing that explained why a 4-star admiral would personally route an Army Staff Sergeant into a SEAL reconnaissance package without a word of elaboration. He had noted the thinness and said nothing. Orders were orders, and the operation was time-sensitive, and some questions answered themselves if you were patient enough to wait for them. What he had observed during the staging was this: she arrived alone without the usual apparatus of coordination that attached itself to personnel borrowed from other units. No liaison officer, no unit representative, no one to make introductions or smooth the institutional friction that typically accompanied inter-service assignments. She arrived, checked the staging area with a single methodical scan, and moved to her position without asking anyone where it should be. She had already decided. She had decided before she arrived. That told him something. He filed it alongside the thin file and the Admiral's signature in the classification marker and continued with his own preparations. The compound occupied a ridgeline 2,247 yards to the southeast. Avery had confirmed the range 3 times with her laser rangefinder, then put the device in her kit and done the calculation manually in her notebook. She always verified both ways. The device could fail for a dozen reasons. The mathematics could not. The compound consisted of 3 primary structures, the largest displaying heat signatures on the upper floor, consistent with a meeting in progress. 12 to 15 individuals clustered in the tight arrangement that suggested a table, a shared map, a shared purpose. Intelligence had placed 3 high-value targets at this location. 3 men who between them constituted the command architecture of a network responsible for significant coalition casualties over the preceding 18 months. Their simultaneous presence in a single location was described in the mission briefing as a convergence event, rare, perishable, the kind of opportunity that arrived once in a long campaign and did not return. The mission parameters were clear: observe and report, No shots were to be taken. Avery had read that line twice. Then she had checked her elevation turret and made a small, precise adjustment. She lay in controlled stillness, now breathing in a 4-count rhythm she had practiced until her body executed it without instruction. Her heart rate held at 52 beats per minute. She knew this not from a monitor, but from the physical literacy that years of extreme range training developed the same way a pilot reads aircraft attitude through the seat of the pants. She knew when her hands were about to steady. She knew when her eyes needed rest before she pushed them again. She knew in the particular way that certainty differs from confidence that she was ready. She was also aware that no one present understood this yet. Chief Brendan Holt materialized from the darkness to her right 20 minutes into her vigil. He was 38 years old and moved with the economy of a large man who had learned through necessity to minimize his presence. The team's forward observer responsible for coordinating fires and confirming targeting data. He had been in special operations for 12 years, had 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to classified locations that appeared in his file only as alphanumeric designations, and he had developed over that time the particular quality of patience that distinguished genuine operators from the theatrical variety. He did not perform patience. He simply had it the way some people have perfect pitch, not as an achievement, but as a characteristic. He lowered himself to one knee beside her position and looked downrange without speaking. A deliberate, genuine stillness. The mark of someone who understood that the best information came to those who did not rush toward it. "You've been running numbers," he said. "Not a question." "Wind is consistent at ground level," Avery said, 12 miles per hour northwest. "But the thermal gradient above the ridgeline will push that higher at midpoint elevation. I'm estimating 18 to 20 through midcourse." Holt was quiet a moment. "You get that from observation. The way the dust is moving at the base of the far slope. The way the guard's poncho hangs differently from the guard's position closer to us." She paused. "The temperature differential between the valley floor and the ridgeline is 9 degrees. That creates a pressure gradient that feeds a consistent upper-level crosswind in terrain configured like this." Holt looked at her steadily in the dark. He had worked alongside a great many snipers over 12 years in special operations. He had never heard one explain micrometeorological analysis by referencing a guard's poncho. "Commander wants a status," he said. "Tell him I'm ready to provide a full targeting assessment when he wants it." Holt considered this. "He'll ask on what authority." "Tell him to read his orders again." Holt almost smiled. He rose and moved back toward the command position without further comment, and Avery returned her eye to the scope. The upper floor of the main building was lit from within. Through the high-powered optics, she could see 3 figures at the leftmost window, gathered around what appeared to be a large table spread with maps or documents. One of them had the bearing of a man accustomed to being the fixed point around which others oriented themselves. The posture of command. She had observed that posture in different theaters in different conflicts, and it was as recognizable as a uniform. She was looking at General Khalid al-Masri. She knew his face from 47 intelligence photographs. She knew his height, his gait, the specific way he turned his head when making a point. She knew from the targeting package presented to her 3 days earlier at Fort Carson that al-Masri was the operational architect of a coordinated campaign that had killed 31 American service members over the preceding year. She knew that his removal from the battlefield had been assessed by analysts whose sole function was such assessments as potentially decisive. She held this knowledge the way she held all operationally relevant information precisely without the weight of sentiment. Sentiment was a variable she had learned to isolate and set aside. It did not belong in the calculation. Commander Rourke arrived at her position 12 minutes after Holt departed. He moved with the deliberateness of a man who was always at some level conducting a tactical assessment of his immediate environment. He settled into a crouch beside her and looked toward the compound through his binoculars without speaking. "You've confirmed 3 principles," he asked. "Confirmed. Al-Masri at the northwest window. Based on stature and movement pattern, the second individual is consistent with General Farouk Bainam Logistics Command. Third is partially obscured but consistent with intelligence photographs of General Dariush Shirazi." Rourke lowered his binoculars. "You determined that from 2,000 yards in the dark." 2,247 yards. "And I've had 3 hours. What's your assessment of the defensive posture?" She had been waiting for this question. 22 guards on perimeter rotation, 4-minute interval, 3 overlapping sectors. The pattern assumes all threat vectors originate from the valley floor. Nothing covers the northeast approach. The guard on the southeast corner takes 4-minute smoke breaks, creating a 17-second gap in coverage of the service entrance. She let a beat pass. The upper floor carries 6 additional personnel beyond the 3 principals. Two of them haven't changed position in 90 minutes. Static protection detail. Rourke stared at her for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Standard Army sniper school doesn't teach that level of defensive pattern analysis, he said. No, Avery said. It doesn't. She returned her eye to the scope. Rourke remained in his crouch, and the question he was carrying did not leave his face, though his face did not change. He had spent 20 minutes during the movement to the observation position working the problem of Avery Drummond. Satellite phone multiple databases, a call to a personnel officer he trusted at Human Resources Command. The personnel officer had located the file, quickly confirmed the basic facts, and then, in a voice that had gone carefully neutral, told him she could not assist further with this particular record and that he should not call back about it. There was a classification marker on the deeper records that Rourke had encountered exactly twice in 16 years, a designation that sat above top secret and above SCY and had no public name because things without public names were easier to deny. He had sat with that knowledge for the rest of the movement and said nothing. Drummond, he said now. Sir, you verified the range manually after the rangefinder. Yes, sir. Why? She was still looking through her scope. Because the math doesn't fail. Equipment fails for a dozen reasons. Atmospheric refraction battery, temperature, reflective surface inconsistencies at extreme range. The mathematics is a constant. If I understand the variables correctly, I trust the calculation before the instrument. Where did you develop that approach? A brief pause, shorter than her usual ones. My father, he's a ballistics engineer. Where does he work? She turned from the scope and looked at him directly. Her eyes in the ambient light were the particular steady green of someone who had been asked this kind of question before. Classified, sir. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he stood. Full targeting assessment in 10 minutes. I want everything you have. Yes, sir. She watched him move back to his command position, then returned to her scope, and the compound continued its business 2,247 yards away, its occupants entirely unaware that someone was building a precise mathematical picture of everything they were doing. Her father's name was Dr. Elliot Drummond. He had spent 19 years at DARPA in a research domain that combined advanced materials, science with projectile dynamics work that was classified in its specifics, but whose general shape meant that Avery had grown up in a household where the dinner table occasionally included the mathematics of objects moving at extreme velocity through resistant environments. Her mother, Professor Constance Drummond, held a joint appointment in applied physics and aerospace engineering at MIT, her specific focus being atmospheric fluid dynamics, the behavior of gases under variable pressure and temperature conditions. Avery had understood by the age of 15 that a bullet in flight was not a simple object tracing a simple arc. It was a complex system interacting continuously with a complex and changing environment. It spun on its axis as it traveled, the rifling of the barrel imparting a gyroscopic stability that simultaneously induced a slow angular drift. It was pulled downward by gravity at a rate that could be calculated precisely if you knew the projectile's ballistic coefficient and its velocity at any given moment. It was pushed laterally by wind, and wind was not a single thing but a layered phenomenon that changed direction and speed at different altitudes, responding to terrain temperature and a dozen other variables that most people never had occasion to consider. And at extreme range beyond a mile, beyond the distances where most practitioners thought about shooting, there was the Earth itself. The planet rotated beneath the bullet's path at a rate that depended on latitude. Once the projectile left the barrel, it was no longer attached to that rotation. It continued on its inertial path while the target moved with the spinning Earth. The effect was negligible at 1,000 yards. At 2,000 yards and beyond, it was measurable, calculable, and consequential. She had learned this from her father at 13. He had sat across from her at the kitchen table in their house in Brookline with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, not giving her formulas to memorize, but deriving them from first principles, walking her through the reasoning until the formula became the only possible conclusion rather than an arbitrary fact to accept. This was how he taught everything, not the conclusion, but the argument that made the conclusion unavoidable. It was, she understood, much later, the most consequential thing anyone had ever taught her, more fundamental than any specific knowledge. It had conveyed the habit of knowing why something had to be true, and not just that it was. She had joined the Army at 20. Not out of romance about service, though she did not think of service as a small thing. Not out of financial necessity, because her family had not produced that kind of necessity. She had joined because she had conducted an honest inventory of what she had been building since she was 13 years old, laid it against the landscape of available applications, and found that there was exactly one legitimate professional context in which it fully applied. She had not told her parents this reasoning in those terms. Her mother would have found the formulation reductive. Her father would have understood it immediately and been quietly saddened by it, because understanding something precisely does not mean you are comfortable with all of its implications. She had simply gone to the recruiting office in Brookline on a Tuesday afternoon and handled the paperwork. 2 years of training, 1 year of assignments that went into her file as standard deployments because the people responsible for her file had reasons to describe them that way. Her performance at sniper school had generated the specific kind of attention that looks like suspicion before it resolves itself, scores that sat outside the distribution in a way that made people check the scoring methodology before they accepted them. They were correct. The methodology was sound. Then the conversation with a man she had never met before and would not see again in a conference room at a facility she had been driven to blindfolded, who explained the Wraith protocol in language so carefully chosen that she grasped immediately both what she was being offered and what it would cost. The offer work that mattered executed at the absolute outer limit of what was technically possible against targets whose removal would have strategic consequence. The cost, everything that most people meant when they used words like recognition, record, acknowledgement, career. She had agreed to the terms without deliberating longer than was necessary. 23 confirmed eliminations over the following 2 years, each one in service of a target package that did not officially exist. Each one executed in isolation, reported through a channel that left no trace in any accessible system, contributing to a strategic picture she was never given full visibility into. The protocol operated on need to know in its most absolute form. Individual assets, individual missions, individual consequences. No team awareness, no shared context. No recognition of any kind, institutional or otherwise. She had agreed to those terms as well. She had not found reason to regret them. Regret required the belief that a better option had been available, and she had examined the option space thoroughly enough to know that it had not. Rourke received the updated intelligence at 4:17, an encrypted burst from the JSOC watch officer. Human source inside the compound reporting 30 minutes earlier. The meeting was scheduled to conclude at 4:45, at which point the 3 generals would be transported separately to 3 different locations by 3 separate security details. After 0445, the intelligence assessment was explicit. There would be no further convergence. The 3 principals had never before occupied the same location simultaneously, and no projected future scenario placed them there again. The window was 28 minutes from right now. Rourke read the message twice. He looked at the compound through his binoculars and calculated what 28 minutes meant against the normal channels for strike authorization, and understood that normal channels could not close this gap. He thought about the young woman 200 meters to his left and the file that had been deliberately emptied of everything worth knowing, and he picked up his radio and called for Holt. "Get me Drummond." Avery reached him in 90 seconds. She moved low and efficient through the terrain and settled beside him without ceremony. She looked at him and waited. He told her the intelligence update in 4 sentences. She absorbed it without expression, the way she absorbed all information processing and filing simultaneously, the analysis already running before the last sentence landed. 28 minutes, she said. From right now. A 3-second silence, the kind she used for calculation. I can provide a targeting assessment. If command wants an elimination option, I can give you what's achievable. What is achievable, Drummond? She met his eyes. All them. Defies. All 3, sequential engagement. I need 12 to 15 seconds between first and third target acquisition. The desert was quiet around them. A guard completed his rotation on the south perimeter, and his boots on the gravel were audible in the stillness. Rourke had a gift for reading people, the specific competence of someone whose survival had depended on accurately assessing the reliability of those around him under extreme pressure. He had encountered confident people who were catastrophically wrong. He had encountered quiet people who were exactly right. He had developed over time a sense for the difference between performance and knowledge. Avery Drummond was not performing. She was telling him what she knew. "You understand what you're describing," he said. 2,247 yards. 3 separate targets. Sequential engagement under time pressure with hostile response expected after the first shot. She did not look away. "Yes, sir. Completely. My best shooter has been doing this for 14 years. He would not attempt that engagement. With respect, Commander, your best shooter is trained for a different operational context." The silence stretched between them in the dark. "Walk me through your numbers," he said. She did. 4 minutes in a low, precise voice covering the atmospheric conditions, the ballistic solution she had constructed over 3 hours of observation, the Coriolis effect at this latitude, and ranged the wind profile built from watching dust and hanging fabric, and the way smoke moved at the base of the far slope. She described the sequencing logic for a 3-target engagement, the firing order that accounted for the available sight lines in the predictable response behavior of each target after the first shot. She spoke the way her mother spoke about atmospheric dynamics, with the calm authority of someone describing things they understood at a fundamental level. When she finished, Rourke was quiet. Then Avery raised her spotting scope and looked not at the compound, but at the terrain to the east, at the dark ridgeline 2,000 meters in the opposite direction. She went motionless in a way that was different from her usual stillness. "Drummond, the ridgeline at bearing 097, she said. Something had shifted in her voice, subtle but unmistakable. 300 meters below the summit, there is a thermal anomaly. Rourke raised his binoculars. "I don't see anything. It's not a heat source, it's an absence. A rectangular cold patch in the rock face approximately 6 feet by 2 feet oriented horizontally." She lowered the spotting scope. "Someone has laid thermal suppressive material on that surface. It reads as a cold signature rather than a neutral one on infrared." The desert seemed to compress around them. "That position has a direct line of sight to our location," she said, "and to the compound." She turned to face him. "Someone established that hide before we arrived." Rourke was already reaching for his radio. He reached Holt first, gave him the bearing and distance, told him to get eyes on it with a thermal imager and report back. Holt acknowledged and was gone. Then Rourke turned to Avery, and what was in his face now was not fear, but something more precise than that, the expression of a man who has recognized that the problem in front of him is substantially larger than the one he thought he was managing. "If that position was prepared before our arrival," he said, "someone knew we were coming. Yes, that's a mission compromise. Yes, it changes the risk calculation." She glanced back toward the compound. "It doesn't change the target picture. 24 minutes remain." Rourke looked at her. He had 16 years of hard decisions, and he was standing at the edge of another one. He reached for his radio to contact the JSOC watch officer, and Avery began to rise to return to her position, and then Holt's voice came through. "Commander." Holt's voice had the economy of someone working to keep their register level. "Thermal imager confirms. Active position, one individual prone, weapon extended. Rifle signature consistent with a .338 Lapua platform. The .338 Lapua Magnum, among the most capable long-range precision cartridges in current military use. At 2,000 meters in trained hands, it was lethal. Established position," Holt continued. "Whoever this is, they've been there a while." Rourke looked at Avery. Avery looked at the ridgeline she could not see with the naked eye. And the night held everything in suspension for a moment that would matter for a long time afterward. The thermal imager showed Holt things that troubled him more the longer he looked. He had been in special operations for 12 years. He had worked alongside and against a range of adversaries, employing a range of equipment, and he had learned to read gear the way a mechanic reads an engine. You could determine a great deal about a person's background and training from what they chose to carry and how they chose to employ it. The individual on the eastern ridgeline was using a suppressor configuration that Holt recognized, a night vision mount bracket of a specific older generation. A spotter's laser rangefinder clipped to the stock in a manner particular to a method of employment that Holt had seen before, not in the field, but in a training environment, specifically in the advanced course he had attended at Fort Bragg in 2011, where the curriculum had included methods that appeared in no public training manual. He photographed the thermal imaging screen systematically, documented everything he could resolve. Then he called Rourke. He described what he was seeing, the configuration details, the employment method, the elements that were generating an increasingly uncomfortable sense of familiarity. Rourke's voice was level. "Are you certain about the mount bracket?" "Certain. It's a generation behind current issue. That particular configuration was standard in a specific training pipeline that ran out of Bragg between 2009 and 2013. I attended a course there in 2011. The instructors used this exact setup." He paused. "Whoever is in that position was trained in the same environment in the same period." A silence. "Then document everything and push it through the encrypted link to JSOC. Specific requests cross-reference the equipment configuration against records of personnel assigned to Delta Force technical advisory roles between 2008 and 2014. The response came back in 11 minutes. Rourke read it on his tablet by the low glow of the screen shield. Read it once, then read it again. Colonel Warren Stiles, former Delta Force, decorated across a 22-year career that had taken him through the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan before transitioning into advisory and technical roles in the program's later years. Assigned to multiple classified positions in his final operational period. Declared missing in action during an unspecified operation in 2014. File status open. Presumed status deceased. That was the official record. Official records in Rourke's experience were accurate about the facts they contained and carefully silent about the facts they did not. The supplementary record, which required an additional access that Rourke had requisitioned and received within the 11-minute window, contained something the official record had been designed to exclude. Stiles had served as a technical advisor to a classified program between 2010 and 2013. The program was identified in the supplementary record only by a code designation, 7 alphanumeric characters that communicated nothing to anyone who did not already know what they referenced. But Rourke had seen that code designation before. It had appeared on the classification marker attached to Avery Drummond's personnel file. The same 7 characters, the same tier, the same deliberate absence of explanatory context. He sat with that for a long moment in the Nevada dark, turning over its implications the way he turned over all important information slowly without committing to a conclusion until the evidence accumulated enough weight to make another conclusion unsupportable. Then he walked to her position. She was at her scope when he arrived, and she did not look up immediately. 21 minutes, she said. All 3 principals confirmed at the northwest window. Drummond, he crouched beside her. The individual on the eastern ridgeline, JSOC, ran a cross-reference on the equipment configuration Holt documented. He told her, he kept it brief and factual. Warren Stiles, former Delta Force, officially missing since 2014, technical advisor to a classified program between 2010 and 2013. He said the code designation aloud. Avery went still. Not the controlled stillness of her shooting position. Something different. The stillness of a mind encountering a piece of information that changes the shape of everything around it. He knows the protocol, she said. It appears so. He knows the employment procedures, the rifle signature, the approach doctrine. She paused. He would have known within a 200-meter radius where any Wraith asset would establish an observation position in this terrain based on the site selection criteria he helped write. Rourke said nothing. The position wasn't prepared for your team, she said. It was prepared for me specifically. She looked at the dark ridgeline to the east. Someone told him about this operation before it happened. Someone in the authorization chain. That is not a conclusion I'm prepared to formalize yet. It's the only conclusion the evidence supports, Commander. The hide was established before our arrival. He recognized the Wraith employment signature well enough to anticipate the observation position. He knew the intelligence picture that triggered this mission, which means he had access to the convergence event data. She paused. The set of people with simultaneous access to all 3 of those elements is very small. Rourke did not argue with the logic. It was sound, and he knew it. He had been following the same chain of reasoning since Holt's first call, and he had arrived at the same place, and he had not said it aloud because saying it aloud changed what it required of him. 19 minutes, Avery said. She looked back at the compound. Commander, I need to tell you what Stiles' presence means for the engagement. He waited. If he was a Wraith technical advisor, he contributed to the employment procedures I use. He knows the acoustic signature of the Barrett M82 in .50B mg at this elevation and this temperature range. He will identify the first shot in under a second. At that point, he will acquire my position and engage. I understand the counter-sniper threat. What you may not know is that he helped develop the counter-sniper response protocol for Wraith assets. He designed the response sequence specifically. He will fire within 1.3 seconds of acoustic identification. She looked at him steadily. My second shot needs to follow the first within 4.2 seconds. My third within 12 seconds total. If Stiles fires at 1.3 seconds and I remain in my shooting position, he will have a valid solution. Rourke was quiet. You're describing a scenario in which you take the second and third shots, while an experienced Delta Force operator with a precision rifle is actively engaging your position. Yes, sir. The space between them was full of the information they were both holding. Then Rourke said, I'm going to abort. Avery did not argue. She did not move. She looked at the compound for a moment through her scope, and then she turned to face him. May I give you a tactical assessment before you make that final call? Go. If we abort now, 3 outcomes follow. First, the principals disperse permanently, and this opportunity is gone. Second, Stiles observes our withdrawal and understands that we detected his position. Third, and most consequential, Stiles reports back to whoever tasked him that the Wraith asset identified the trap and pulled out. She let that land. At that point, the entire network changes its architecture. Safe house locations, communication frequencies, meeting protocols, transportation patterns. Everything Stiles shared about Wraith methodology becomes the foundation of a new counterintelligence structure. We will not get another opportunity against these three commanders. We will not get a clean opportunity against anything connected to this network for a significant period afterward. Rourke looked at the ridgeline. He thought about what she was saying, and the problem with what she was saying was that it was correct. You're asking me to put you back in that position knowing Styles will engage. I'm asking you to consider an alternative approach. She described it. Styles fires at 1.3 seconds after my first shot. He needs approximately 0.9 seconds to acquire and confirm the position by acoustic identification. That gives me a 0.4-second window between his acquisition and his engagement. If I execute a lateral shift of 8 inches before his window closes, his firing solution is invalid. At this range is 0. 4-second positional change of 8 inches changes the impact point enough to miss. Rourke stared at her. You're talking about moving between shots. Between shots, not during. That is not in any training protocol I have seen. No, she said it simply. Not with pride, not with any performance of humility either. Simply as a factual statement about the limits of what training manuals contain. He sat with this. He had 16 years of building an accurate model of human capability, of knowing what trained people could and could not do, of understanding the difference between what was advertised and what was real. He tested what she was describing against that model. Training manuals were written for trained snipers. She was describing something that lived in the space that training reached toward but could not document. There's a second element, she said. Styles fires once and collects feedback from the impact. If I move between shots, his feedback is corrupted. He will need time to recalculate. That recalculation window is where Holt finds him. Rourke saw it immediately. I send Holt to the eastern ridgeline now. He's in place by the time Styles fires. With 2 operators, yes, Styles fires, believes he has a valid solution, begins follow-up preparation. Holt is on him before the follow-up shot happens. Holt needs 6 minutes minimum to reach that position quietly. We have 17 minutes before the window closes. Rourke looked at the compound. He looked at the ridgeline. He did the arithmetic. If Holt is compromised on the approach, Styles relocates and we lose containment. Yes. If Styles relocates before your first shot, he fires from an unknown position and we have no counter. Yes. The plan depends on Holt reaching position without compromise, on you executing 3 sequential shots while moving between them, and on the timing holding across all elements simultaneously. Yes. The silence lasted 10 seconds. Rourke thought about Petty Officer Marcus Webb. Webb had gone into a building in 2009 on the strength of an intelligence assessment that turned out to be wrong in one critical particular, and he had not come out. Rourke had written the letter to Webb's family himself at 2 in the morning at a field desk, meaning every word he put down. He had made a promise to himself that night about the kind of decisions he would make afterward. The problem was that the promise was about incomplete information, and information in this work was always incomplete. The question was never whether you had complete information. The question was whether you had enough and whether the person you were trusting understood accurately what they could do. He looked at Avery Drummond. She was 24 years old. She had a file that someone had deliberately stripped of everything significant. She had identified a counter-sniper position in total darkness at 2,000 meters by watching patterns in dust in the hang of a man's poncho. She had built a ballistic solution in a weatherproof notebook that accounted for variables most practitioners never considered. And she was looking at him now with the steady green eyes of someone who had done the calculation and arrived at the answer and was waiting for him to catch up. He keyed his radio. Holt, I need you on the eastern ridgeline in 6 minutes. 2 operators, northern approach, absolute noise discipline. Contain the position and hold. No engagement until I give the word. Holt's acknowledgement came back without hesitation. Moving now. Rourke looked at Avery. If Styles fires before Holt contains him, I call the abort and we extract. All of us. Understood. If you're hit, the mission is over. Understood. You have authorization to engage all 3 principals on my mark. Not before. Yes, sir. He held her gaze. Then he said something that had not been part of his plan. Drummond, the real reason you're here. I want the actual answer. She looked at him. The question sat between them in the cold Nevada dark, and for a moment he thought she would give him the answer that people gave when they wanted to avoid the real one, the answer about duty, mission, institutional obligation. Those answers were all true, but none of them were the actual answer. She said, because I'm the only one who can make this shot. It was the most honest thing she had said since she arrived. And it told him everything about the file that someone had emptied, not to protect a secret from enemies, but because some capabilities exist so far outside the normal classification categories that the normal categories themselves become a liability. "Get back to your position," he said. "Wait for my mark." She moved, low, efficient, precise through the terrain, back to the rock formation, back to the Barrett and the notebook and the cold ground. She opened the notebook and began the final pre-engagement calculations. Muzzle velocity 2,887 feet per second, corrected for temperature. At 41 degrees Fahrenheit, powder burn rate was reduced from standard, and she applied the correction factor her father had explained to her at 13 years old using equations he wrote on a paper grocery bag because he hadn't had a notepad close at hand. Ballistic coefficient, 0.702, the measure of the projectile's ability to maintain velocity against air resistance. At 2,247 yards, a round leaving at 2,887 feet per second would arrive at approximately 1,340 feet per second, still supersonic, still gyroscopically stable, but a substantially different object from what had left the barrel. Bullet drops. She worked this with care because it was the variable that failed shots at extreme range more reliably than any other. Gravity did not negotiate. At this range, with the corrected velocity and the specific ballistic coefficient of this round, the bullet would drop approximately 418 inches below the bore line across its 2.44-second flight, 34 feet. She verified the elevation setting on her scope against the pencil calculation, and they agreed. Wind. 19 miles per hour at mid-course. She had settled on 19 rather than the midpoint of her estimated range because of the slight acceleration she had observed in upper-level dust patterns against the northwest ridgeline, consistent with a Venturi effect through a gap in the rock formation 700 meters upwind. 19 miles per hour across 2.44 seconds of flight time, 19 inches of lateral drift. She would hold 19 inches into the wind. Atmospheric pressure, 29.91 inches of mercury, slightly above sea level standard. Higher pressure meant denser air, marginally greater drag, marginally faster velocity decay. She applied the correction factor. Coriolis effect at this latitude, shooting to the southeast. Earth's rotation would deflect the bullet approximately 4 inches to the right across the full flight time. She applied it. She cross-checked the result against the mental calculation she had already run an hour earlier, and the numbers were the same. She closed the notebook, looked through the scope. All three principals remained at the northwest window. 17 minutes. She was ready. 8 minutes passed. Holt checked in. 2 operators at position on the northern approach to the eastern ridgeline, 200 meters from the hide. No compromise. Subject still, prone, weapon extended, no change in posture. The hide remained active. Rourke keyed his radio. "Drummond, confirm targets." All three principals confirmed at northwest window. Range verified. Solution current. Styles. Holt, subject holding position, no movement. 13 minutes remained. Rourke stood with his binoculars and looked at the compound and thought about the 3 men in that lit window and what they were planning and what it had already cost and what it would continue to cost if they walked out of that building tonight and dispersed into the architecture of a network that would then rebuild itself around their continued existence. He thought about the leak in the authorization chain. He thought about Warren Styles in a prepared hide waiting with the patience of someone who had been doing this for more than 2 decades. He thought about Marcus Webb. He thought about the specific quality of Avery Drummond's voice when she had said, "With no performance and no particular emotion, because I'm the only one who can make this shot." He pressed transmit. "Drummond, you are authorized to engage. Fire at will." A pause of 2 seconds. In that pause, in the absolute silence of the Nevada desert at 4:31 in the morning, with 8 operators positioned across a 2-kilometer arc and 1 woman with a weatherproof notebook and a 29-pound mathematical instrument, Seth Rourke heard something that he would find difficult to describe accurately to anyone who asked him about it afterward. The pause before the certain thing. The specific quality of silence that exists in the moment before someone does something they have been preparing to do their entire life. Avery Drummond exhaled precisely half a breath and held, and the night broke open. The Barrett M82 fires with a sound that is not like other sounds. It is not the sharp crack of a smaller caliber rifle, not the contained report of a suppressed weapon, not anything that the word gunshot adequately contains. It is a concussive event, a physical pressure rolling outward from the muzzle in all directions, simultaneously crossing the desert floor and climbing the rock faces and moving through the cold Nevada air like something that has been compressed for a long time and has finally been permitted to release. The round left the barrel at 2,887 feet per second. In the same fraction of a second, Avery moved, not away from the rifle, not abandoning the position. A lateral shift of 8 inches to the left, executed in the 0.4-second window between the round leaving the barrel and the moment she had calculated Warren Styles would complete his acoustic acquisition sequence and have a valid firing solution on her position. She had rehearsed the movement in her mind during the preceding 17 minutes. Not because the physical mechanics were complicated, they were not, but because the timing required integration into her shooting cycle at a specific point that could not corrupt her solution for the second target. She had found the point. She had rehearsed it until she was certain. The round traveled 2,247 yards in 2.44 seconds. General Khalid al-Masri was leaning over the table with both hands on its surface, making a point about something on the map in front of him when the bullet arrived. The two men standing with him had been listening. This arrangement of things in that room was the last arrangement before everything changed permanently. Hold eye to the thermal imager saw the impact. Target 1, he said, quiet, factual, confirmed. On the eastern ridgeline, Warren Stiles heard the Barrett fire. He had been waiting for that sound for 40 minutes, maintaining the physical and mental discipline of someone who had done this kind of waiting in cold, dark places across a long career. He had calibrated his response specifically to the acoustic signature of the M82 in 0.50B mg at this elevation and temperature range. He identified it in 0.7 seconds faster than Avery had estimated by 0.2 of a second. His finger was already at the trigger. He fired. The round went to the position where Avery had been 0.4 seconds ago. It struck the rock formation 4 inches to the right of where her right elbow had been resting. The impact scattered stone fragments in a lateral spray that crossed the back of her left hand, a sharp, brief sting that she cataloged and set aside. She was already finding the second target. General Farouk Benham had turned toward the window in response to the sound of al-Masri falling. He was a heavy-set man, and he turned with the particular deliberateness of someone whose mind has registered that something has happened but has not yet committed to a conclusion about what it means or requires. That hesitation occupied 1.8 seconds. Avery used 1.6 of them. The second shot broke the night open again. The Barrett's report moved outward across the terrain, and Holt counted under his breath at his position, and Rourke stood at his with binoculars raised and jaw set, watching the upper floor window, watching for the response of the security forces, calculating how many seconds they had before the compound organized into something coherent. Target 2, confirmed. On the eastern ridgeline, Stiles heard the second shot and understood that he had missed. He was already running the correction calculation when the thing he had spent his entire career training to detect changed in the peripheral awareness around him, a disturbance in the quality of the darkness to his north that was not wind and not an animal, a change in the pattern of the night that had no innocent explanation. He began to move. Fast. The instinct of a man with 22 years of hard training and the additional urgency of someone who knows precisely what his capture means. He was not fast enough. Holt's 2 operators cleared the ridgeline from the north at a run, crossing the final ground between them and the hide with the speed that comes from 200 meters of controlled, silent approach, followed by a deliberate sprint. The first operator reached Stiles as he was clearing the thermal suppressive material, and the struggle that followed was brief and absolute and ugly, in the way that close-quarters physical contests between trained men always are. Stiles fought with the focused economy of someone who knew which targets mattered and which movements created opportunity. He took the first operator's grip, broke it, and drove an elbow into the man's face with enough force to split the cheekbone and drop him to one knee in a burst of immediate serious pain. The second operator arrived before Stiles could extend any advantage and got his right arm behind his back at the specific angle that collapses a joint's resistance, regardless of the attached person's strength or will. The struggle ended in 4 seconds. Stiles went face down in the Nevada dirt. The first operator, Petty Officer Second Class David Mercer, who would later require 2 hours of surgery at the facility to set the fractured bone and 6 weeks of recovery before he returned to operational status, came back to both feet and continued working. This was what distinguished professional from amateur more than any other single quality. Not the absence of damage, the continuation despite it. Holt cleared the ridgeline crest 15 seconds after his operators looked at the scene, looked at the thermal suppressive material and the rifle and the rangefinder clipped to the stock, and recognized what he was looking at with the recognition of someone who had been following a chain of evidence to its end and had arrived there. Containment, he said into the radio. Subject secured. No shots fired from our side. Rourke acknowledged. Avery was on the third target. General Darius Shirazi had not hesitated the way Bainham had. He had dropped immediately a trained defensive response that spoke to years of operating in environments where the sound of a shot required immediate cover seeking rather than assessment. He was partially visible through the window frame, crouching low, moving toward the interior door. She could resolve his left shoulder and the upper portion of his head. He was moving with the purposeful urgency of a man who understood he was under fire and was managing the geometry of his exposure. He was 3 seconds from the door. The third shot required prediction, not estimation. Prediction. The specific mathematical projection of where a moving object would be at a precisely calculated future moment, combined with the adjustment for the 2.44-second flight time, such that the round and the target arrived at the same point in space simultaneously. It was the most technically demanding engagement in precision marksmanship, and at 2,247 yards against a partially obscured target, moving with the urgency of a man trying to remain alive, the margin for error was measured in fractions of a degree. She had 1.2 seconds to execute it. What happened in this 1.2 seconds was not a conscious calculation in the way that the term calculation usually implies. There was not time for deliberation. What occurred was the synthesis of 4 years of Wraith training and 24 years of living inside the mathematics of objects, moving through the physical world compressed into something that operated below the level of deliberation and expressed itself as certainty. The way a musician's hands find a chord in the dark. The way a carpenter's eye levels a surface before the level is placed. She knew where he was going to be. She led him by the calculated amount. The third shot left the barrel. Shirazi was 2 steps from the door when the round arrived. He did not complete those steps. Holt's voice came through the radio. The same economy, the same factual register that communicated information without decoration because some information was too significant to require decoration. Target 3 confirmed. 12.3 seconds. 3 shots. 3 confirmed eliminations at a range that appeared in no training manual as viable in conditions of darkness and physical threat executed by a staff sergeant whose official file said nothing worth reading. Rourke lowered his binoculars. He was quiet for a long moment. Not from shock, though what he had witnessed occupied a category of professional experience he had no existing framework for. He was quiet because the work was not finished, and there was a sequence of things that needed to happen, and he was a man who understood the importance of sequence. All elements, this is Rourke, weapons safe. Begin extraction sequence. Drummond, break down your position and move to rally point Alpha. Holt, secure the subject and bring him to the vehicles. We are moving in 4 minutes. He paused. Then he said quietly to the desert, in the darkness, in the 3 windows that now had no one standing at them, unfucking believable. Avery was already breaking down the Barrett. Bipod folded, scope caps closed. Rifle into the case in the prescribed sequence, each component finding its place in the dark by touch rather than sight. She cleared the notebook from beside her position and put it inside her jacket against her chest, where it would survive anything short of a direct impact. She looked at the compound one final time without the rifle. The upper floor windows were still lit. Movement inside now, the frantic, disorganized movement of an organization discovering that its leadership has been removed and not yet understanding the full dimensions of that fact. Voices audible across the distance, thin and attenuated by the 2,247 yards between them, carrying the specific register of people confronting an event that their preparation had not encompassed. She picked up the rifle case and moved toward the rally point. The movement to the vehicles took 11 minutes through difficult terrain and total darkness. Each operator managed his own footing and his own security sector, the group flowing through the landscape with the practiced coordination of people who had stopped thinking about the coordination itself and simply did it. Avery was positioned in the middle of the file rifle case over one shoulder, breathing at the pace of the movement. She did not think about the shots. There would be time for that later in some other context in the way she always processed the work after the fact, not with sentiment, but with the same analytical attention she gave the preparation. During the movement, she thought about the terrain, the threat picture, and the interval before the compound's security forces organized into a coherent response. Stiles moved 30 meters to her left between 2 operators, zip-tied and silent. He walked with the deliberate steadiness of a man conserving himself for what came next. He was 52 years old, and he had the build of someone who had maintained the physical standards of his profession long after the profession's institutional obligations had ended. Whatever he had become in the years since 2014, he had not become careless about his body. He turned his head once during the movement and looked at her. She did not look away immediately. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to communicate that she had seen him and was not unsettled by being seen. Then she looked forward and kept moving. Rourke had them at the vehicles by 0454. 2 armored SUVs and a logistics vehicle in a dry wash 3 kilometers from the observation position, covered with signature reduction netting. The drivers had the engines running. Loading took 90 seconds. Stiles went into the second vehicle. Rourke, Avery, and Holt rode in the first. They were moving before Rourke spoke. Holt, status on the compound's response. QRF is moving toward the valley floor. They're looking in the wrong direction. We have at least 20 minutes before they run a proper grid search of the northern approach. A pause. The three targets are confirmed through our thermal imaging record. We have documentation. Good. Rourke was watching the road ahead. The vehicles ran dark, no headlights, drivers on night vision. Complete after-action records from all elements. Drummond, that includes your ballistic documentation. Yes, sir. Holt, the subject, has he said anything? Nothing? He'll talk at the facility. Rourke said it as logistics. JSOC wants him in the technical exploitation program before he has time to construct a narrative. He has information about the authorization chain compromise, and they want it intact. Holt nodded. Avery looked out the window at the desert moving past. The sky to the east was beginning to differentiate itself from the darkness. The first faint gradient of approaching morning, a blue at the horizon that was barely distinguishable from black, but was not the same as black. She watched it and thought about the authorization chain. Stiles had known about the operation before it happened. He had known the intelligence convergence data, the timeline, the Wraith employment signature. The number of people with simultaneous access to all three of those elements was very small. She followed the chain back to its narrowest point and arrived at the same place she had arrived during the observation phase. And she sat with it the way she sat with all difficult information, without the luxury of hoping it meant something else. Then she stopped following it. There were things that were her problem and things that were not. The leak was not her problem tonight. What was her problem was the rifle case at her feet and the notebook against her chest and the work that had already been done and needed to be preserved accurately. Her radio carried the encryption signature she had been assigned 4 years ago in the conference room at the facility she had been driven to blindfolded. She had heard this signature 6 times since then. Each time it had meant that something was changing. The voice that followed was Frost, brief, stripped of everything that was not essential. Asset Drummond. Wraith protocol is terminated effective this transmission. All field assets are released from operational standing. Asset Drummond, no further contact on this channel. Acknowledge. Avery looked at the radio for a moment. Acknowledged. The channel went dead. Holt was looking at her. Rourke had heard, and his focus remained on the road ahead, but the set of his shoulders communicated that he understood the language of what he had just heard, even without the context. She thought about what terminated meant in operational terms. The program ceased to exist. The assets of the program of which she was one were no longer part of any official structure. The 4 years of work, the 23 prior missions, the 3 shots she had taken 40 minutes ago, existed in a category that was becoming, with each passing minute, a category of things that had not happened. She understood why. Stiles in custody represented a specific kind of intelligence liability. He knew the protocol's employment doctrine, its personnel, pipeline, its operational methods. Whatever he had shared with the network he had been serving, and whatever that network had done with that information, the potential damage could only be contained one way: by making the thing he knew cease to exist as an active program. You cannot compromise a program that no longer operates. Wraith protocol terminated. Clean and total and permanent. She pressed her hand against the notebook inside her jacket. Still there. Still warm. The only physical record of tonight's work that would not be administratively erased by morning. The facility was a building on a base that was officially something administrative and practically something else. They arrived at 5:47. The sun was beginning to establish itself across the Nevada desert, turning the eastern sky a pale, serious orange that had nothing to recommend it except its honesty. Avery stood outside the vehicle for a moment and looked at it. Then she went inside. The debrief occupied 3 hours. She was separated from Rourke and Holt immediately, which was protocol, and taken to a room where 2 people she had never met, neither hostile nor friendly, simply professional in the way of people whose job is to build accurate records without annotating them, asked her questions about the mission in systematic order. The questions were precise and thorough, and revealed by their specificity that at least one of the 2 people in this room had significant operational experience. They knew what details mattered. They knew which questions illuminated the seams where problems hid. She answered everything completely and accurately. She described the ballistic solution in the sequence she had built it variable by variable. She described the atmospheric conditions and how she had derived them from observation rather than instrumentation. She described the sequencing logic for the 3-target engagement, the firing order, and the reasoning behind it. She described the lateral shift, the 8-inch movement, the 0.4-second window, the logic of using Stiles' own response protocol against him. She described the timing. She described the content of the encrypted communication from Frost at 0452 during the convoy. She did not produce the notebook. When the session concluded and the two people had collected their materials and departed, she sat alone in the room for a moment in the institutional quiet of a building that existed to process things that could not be processed anywhere else. She sat with the notebook against her chest and thought about what she had said and what she had not said, whether the distinction mattered in any practical way she could identify, and whether the record being built in this room would survive the administrative process that was clearly already in motion. She concluded that it would not. That was the point of administrative processes like the one in motion. Then she asked the guard outside the door if she could speak with Commander Rourke before she departed. Rourke appeared 14 minutes later. He came in alone, closed the door, sat across from her without ceremony. He had the quality of someone who had been thinking without interruption since the operation concluded and had arrived at a resting place that was not comfortable but was at least honest. She reached inside her jacket and took out the notebook and placed it on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at the worn olive drab cover, the weatherproof binding, the specific dimensions of something made for a purpose, no supply catalog acknowledged. He understood immediately what it contained, what it documented, and what she was asking him to do with it. The understanding registered in a small, specific way. His hand came down flat on the cover before either of them had spoken. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'll keep it where it won't be found by anyone who would use it badly," he said. She assessed this statement in the way she assessed all statements of consequence, by looking at what she knew about the person making it and asking whether the statement was consistent with that knowledge. It was. She had been forming this assessment for the preceding several hours, and she had a conclusion. "That's all I need," she said. He sat across from her. He looked tired in the specific way that comes after sustained precision. Not physical exhaustion, but the aftermath of prolonged alertness, the body releasing the tension that operational necessity had required it to hold. "Styles is talking," he said. He gave up the contact in the authorization chain within the first hour at the facility. "I can't tell you who it was. I can tell you it's being handled through the appropriate channels." She nodded. "The 3 targets are confirmed through multiple feeds. Post-strike surveillance shows complete command disruption at the compound. Communications intercepts are consistent with an organization that has simultaneously lost its senior leadership without succession protocol in place." He looked at her steadily. "The preliminary strategic assessment is what the targeting package projected." She drank the coffee that had been placed in front of her at some point during the debrief. It was cold now. "Drummond," he stopped, began again. "What you did this morning was the most technically extraordinary thing I have witnessed in 16 years of special operations. I have worked with the finest precision shooters in the American military. None of them approached what you did at that range under those conditions against an active counter-sniper threat." He paused. "I want that said between us. Clearly. Even if it can never be said anywhere else." "Thank you, Commander. I also need to tell you something, and I'm sorry for what it means." He opened a folder and turned it toward her. She looked at the document, read it once at speed, then again more carefully. It was brief. The operative language occupied 2 sentences in the middle of the second paragraph. "Staff Sergeant Avery Drummond, United States Army, was formally separated from service effective the date printed at the top of the document. The separation was characterized as voluntary and processed under administrative provisions requiring no further explanation from the separating authority." The date at the top of the document was 3 days ago, 72 hours before the mission. She understood the full architecture of it immediately. If anything had gone wrong, if she had been captured, killed, or had created any kind of visible incident, there was no active duty service member on scene. There was no government employee. There was no program, no accountability, no chain of command that could be questioned or compelled. There was only a civilian woman with a rifle in the Nevada desert, and whatever she had done there existed in a category that the government could regard from a comfortable distance. They had written her out before the first shot. Admiral Pace had signed it. Someone in the authorization chain, possibly the same someone who was now being processed through an intelligence exploitation program at this facility, had leaked the mission to Styles. And Pace, who either knew about the leak or had reason to suspect the operation carried elevated risk, had ensured that the institutional exposure was 0 before authorizing it to proceed. She sat with this for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the window now, pale and direct. "He knew about the counter-sniper threat," she said. "Or he had reason to believe the operational security was compromised." Rourke's jaw tightened. "The investigation will determine what he knew and when he knew it. And in the meantime, he's protected by a document dated 3 days ago." "Yes," she nodded. "Not an agreement, an acknowledgement. There was a difference." "There will be a financial settlement," Rourke said, "processed through a mechanism that doesn't generate a traceable record. It won't reflect the actual value of what you contributed. Nothing could. But it will be sufficient for a period of time. I'm not concerned about the settlement. I know, he paused. Is there anything I can do for you within what I'm actually able to do? She considered the question genuinely. She was not the kind of person who deflected it out of toughness. She thought about what she actually needed from this conversation before it ended. Write down what happened, she said. Not officially, not in anything that can be accessed or subpoenaed or used. Just write it down. Keep it somewhere. He looked at her for a long moment. I will, he said. Then we're finished. She stood. He stood. They shook hands, and it was the handshake of two people who had occupied the same difficult situation at the same difficult moment and had done what was necessary and would carry it in their separate ways for the rest of their separate lives. It was not the handshake of a superior and a subordinate. That distinction had been administratively dissolved 3 days ago. She left the building at 11:20 in the morning. The Nevada sun was high, and the desert was a different thing in daylight, stripped of the drama and threat that darkness gave it, reduced to its actual elements, rock and scrub and distance, and the silence that had been present before any of them arrived and would be present long after they were gone. She stood in the parking area for a moment and breathed the cold, dry air and looked at the mountains to the east, and then she walked to the rental car and drove toward Reno. 3 hours. She did not turn on the radio. She thought about the notebook now in Rourke's inside jacket pocket and what would happen to it. She thought about Wraith and the 4 years and the 23 previous missions, and this one, which had been the 24th, and which was also the last. She thought about the document dated 3 days ago, and the 2 sentences that had placed her outside every institutional protection before she fired around. She thought about Portland. She had passed through Portland once 3 years ago in transit between 2 places she could not name. She had stopped for coffee at a place near an independent bookstore and sat for an hour watching a street that moved at a human pace, and she had felt something that she rarely felt, which was the sensation of a place that could contain a different version of her life if she chose to let it. She had filed the feeling and returned to the work and not thought about it again until recently, when thinking about it had begun to seem less like distraction and more like information. At the airport, she returned the rental car and found a bookstore in the terminal and bought 3 books. Physics, 2 of them. One of them was in her mother's specific area, Atmospheric Fluid Dynamics, a recent publication she had not read. She boarded her flight and found her seat and opened it, and the mathematics in the first chapter was familiar and settling in the way of something you have known for a long time in one form and are now encountering in another. The Nevada desert fell away beneath the aircraft as they climbed vast and flat and tan, and somewhere in that landscape was a rock formation with a scuff where a rifle bipod had rested for 4 hours, and 8 inches to the right of that mark was a chip where a .338 Lapua round had struck at precisely the moment the position it was aimed at was no longer occupied by anyone. In a few weeks, the wind would fill both marks with dust, and there would be nothing left to indicate that anything had occurred there at all. That was fine. She turned a page and kept reading. 3 months later, Lieutenant Commander Seth Rourke sat in his office at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. The promotion had come through 6 weeks after the Nevada operation processed through channels that made no reference to the specifics of what had happened there. The citation noted exceptional leadership in classified operations and sustained judgment under conditions of significant operational complexity. It said nothing specific because nothing specific could be said. The ceremony had been brief and correct, the handshakes genuine, if uninformed, and he had returned to his desk the same afternoon and found when he sat down that the promotion felt like it had happened to someone who was still becoming who he was going to be. He did not know entirely what to do with that. He had set it aside and returned to work, which was what he always did with things he did not know what to do with yet. He had requested the intelligence summary through formal channels 3 weeks after the operation and waited for access to be granted, which took longer than it should have, and suggested that someone above him in the information architecture had needed to decide something before permitting him to see it. He read it now for the 3rd time at his desk with the afternoon light coming through the window, at the angle it always came at this time of year, and he read it the way he read all things that mattered, slowly, giving each sentence the full weight of his attention before moving to the next. The summary had been compiled from signals, intercepts, human source reporting, satellite imagery analysis, and post-strike assessment conducted over 3 months by analysts whose names he did not know and whose institutional location was described only by a code that appeared in none of his clearance documentation. They had been thorough. They had been, he concluded, very good. The elimination of the 3 principles had produced cascading effects that the targeting package had projected, but that were nonetheless striking to encounter in this documented form. Without al-Masri's operational architecture, the network had been unable to coordinate across its component cells. The cells had attempted to operate independently and had produced visible friction of a kind that intelligence collection was particularly well suited to exploit competition for resources. Contradictory, tactical decisions degraded communication, security as local commanders improvised protocols they did not have the training to maintain. Without Benham's logistics function, the material supply chain had fractured into competing local arrangements that were simultaneously less efficient and dramatically more visible to signals and imagery collection. Without Shirazi's intelligence operation, the network's ability to anticipate coalition activity had degraded to a level that had enabled several successful operations that analysis suggested would not previously have been feasible. The summary characterized the cumulative strategic effect of the three eliminations as decisive. That word appeared rarely in formal assessments. It meant not merely significant, but determinative. The kind of outcome that, when analysts looked back at the arc of a campaign, they identified as the inflection point at which the eventual conclusion became apparent in the data before it became apparent to anyone on the ground. 3 shots, 12.3 seconds. One woman in the dark with a weatherproof notebook and a mathematical instrument that had weighed 29 pounds. Rourke set the summary down. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the legal pad paper unnetworked, not connected to any system that could be queried, subpoenaed, or accessed without physical possession of the object itself. He had been adding to it periodically since his return from Nevada. It had become, he recognized, a document without a category. Not a report, not a memoir, not a record in any official sense. Something more like testimony in the original meaning of the word. A statement made by someone who was present for no one in particular against the possibility that the truth of something mattered, even when the system that was supposed to preserve it had decided it did not. He read what he had written. Then he uncapped the pen and added to it. He wrote about the pause before she fired, the 2 seconds between his authorization and the shot, and what was in that silence and how it had felt to be standing in it. He wrote about the 8-inch lateral shift between the first and second shots, which he had not fully registered in the moment and which he had thought about many times since. What it required technically. What it said about the preparation behind it. The fact that she had rehearsed it in her mind 40 times before she executed it once in the dark, while an experienced Delta Force operator was solving for her position. He wrote about the separation document dated 3 days before the mission. He wrote about what that meant and what it implied about the people who had authorized it and what he thought of those implications in language that was more direct than anything he would have put into an official document. He wrote about the handshake at the end, how it had been the handshake of equals and what that said about all the institutional categories that had governed both their careers up to that moment and what it said about those categories that the moment had made them feel beside the point. He wrote for 35 minutes, then he locked the legal pad back in the drawer. He had a class of junior snipers that afternoon. New candidates at the beginning of the pipeline carrying the particular combination of ambition and inexperience that characterized everyone at the threshold of something difficult and consequential. There were 22 of them sitting in rows in a training room that smelled of coffee and cleaning solution and the particular institutional neutrality of spaces designed to receive many different people without favoring any of them. They watched him with the attentiveness of people who understood that the man at the front of the room had been somewhere they wanted to go and had come back changed by it in ways they could not yet fully read. He had been adding a single element to his opening session with each new group for the past 3 months. It was not in the curriculum. It was not on any slide. It was not anything he had told anyone about or sought approval for. He simply said it once at the beginning and let it sit with them for the duration of whatever followed. He picked up a marker. He turned to the whiteboard. He wrote a single number. 2,247. He looked at it for his moment. The number meant something specific to him that it did not mean to anyone in this room. It meant a rock formation in the Nevada desert and a weatherproof notebook, and 3 shots in 12.3 seconds, and a woman who moved 8 inches to the left at exactly the right moment because she had done the calculation and understood precisely when that moment would arrive. It meant a document dated 3 days before the mission that had written someone out of the record before she had done the thing the record would never contain. He turned back to the class. Your training manual specifies a maximum effective range, he said. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something about that number. The maximum effective range in your manual was defined by the people who wrote the manual based on what they had seen and what they could verify through their own experience and the experience of the people they had worked with. He paused, letting the distinction settle. It was not defined by the actual limit of what is possible, It was defined by the limit of what they knew was possible, which is a different thing. Another pause. Someone already went past it. Someone already worked the mathematics that your manual says cannot be worked in conditions your manual would have called prohibitive, under circumstances your manual does not have a category for. Your responsibility is to be ready for the day you are asked to do the same. And you will be asked. The nature of this work is that someone will always need something that is not in the manual. He set the marker down. We'll cover the specifics. Let's get started. In Portland, Oregon, on a residential street 3 blocks from an independent bookstore that stayed open until 10 and kept a small philosophy section near the back that Avery had been making her way through, she had found an apartment 6 weeks after leaving Nevada. Third floor of a building that had once been something industrial. North-facing windows that admitted a quality of light she found useful for extended reading. She had furnished it gradually without urgency, acquiring things as she identified their necessity rather than assembling them according to a plan. A desk, a chair she had spent more on than she expected to. Bookshelves that were filling from the bottom up. She had a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Same table most mornings by the window, positioned to see the street in both directions without requiring deliberate attention. Same order. 2 hours of reading before the street became busy enough to constitute a distraction. The routine had assembled itself without her consciously constructing it, the way routines do when you give them sufficient time and do not interrupt them. She had not touched a rifle in 3 months. She had not sought one out. She was not certain yet whether she missed it or whether what she noticed was the shape of its absence, which was not the same thing as missing. Absence had a shape and a weight and a place in the room, and she was learning that shape the same way she learned everything, by paying attention to what was actually there rather than what she had expected to find. The physics textbook was open on the desk to a chapter on pressure differentials and variable terrain, specifically the behavior of wind moving through geographic constrictions, the acceleration effect that her mother had spent a significant portion of her career modeling mathematically. Reading it was like encountering informal academic language, something she had known for years as sensation and practical application. She had always understood the phenomenon from its consequences, the way it modified ballistic calculations at extreme range, the way it changed what needed to be accounted for, and by how much. Reading the theoretical foundation was like learning the grammar of a language she had already been speaking. Not learning the language. Understanding at a new level why it worked the way it did. There was something in this that she found genuinely satisfying. She was not certain yet what to call it. It felt like a beginning. Her phone was a number she had acquired 6 weeks ago and given to exactly 2 people, her father and her mother. She had called her mother twice in that period from a coffee shop table, not unlike the one she was sitting at now, conversations that moved through the usual territories, how she was, what she was reading, whether she had found a good grocery store in the neighborhood. She had not told her mother what had happened in Nevada because there was no version of that information that could be shared without creating a problem for which she had no solution ready. She had told her she was well, which was true in most of the ways that mattered. It rang now. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, area code that corresponded to nothing in her personal geography. She looked at it for 5 seconds. She thought about the desert at 3:40 in the morning and the cold coming up through the ground and the 34 feet of arc the bullet traced in its 2.44-second journey and the 8-inch movement she had rehearsed in her mind 40 times before she executed it once. She thought about the separation document and the notebook in a locked drawer in Coronado and Rourke writing on a legal pad in language that was not operational and was not classified and was simply honest. She thought about Wraith Protocol terminated and what it meant and what it did not mean. Because termination and ending were not always the same thing, and she had learned the distinction. She thought about 3 months of mornings at this table, this coffee, this window. She thought about the bottom of the philosophy shelf, which she had not yet reached. She thought about her mother's chapter on pressure differentials and the particular satisfaction of understanding something at a new level. The phone rang again. She looked at it. She let the decision exist in the space before it was made, because decisions made in that space were the kind you understood fully when you made them. When she had sat in the conference room 4 years ago and agreed to the Wraith Protocol's terms, she had made the decision there in that space and she had not regretted it. Not because the terms were good terms, but because she had understood them completely before she agreed. She understood these terms too. Whatever the 4 words said, whatever context followed them, she understood the general shape of what answering would mean, and what it would cost, and what it was unlikely to provide in the form of protection, recognition, or any of the institutional scaffolding that normal careers carried. She understood all of this. She picked up the phone. She did not say her name. She said nothing. She waited for whoever was on the other end to speak first because that was information too, and she had learned a long time ago that everything was information if you paid sufficient attention to it. A voice said 4 words. She listened to them. She looked out the window at the Portland morning, at the street in its ordinary motion, at the people moving through it, at the particular pace of people who were going somewhere they chose to go in a city that did not know what had occurred in the Nevada desert 3 months ago and would not know, and that was proceeding through its life accordingly. She looked at the physics textbook open on the table. Her mother's chapter on pressure differentials with its precise and careful account of how wind moved through the world, how it accelerated through the gaps between things, how it became something different in transit than it had been at its origin. She closed the textbook. She folded her jacket over her arm. She walked out into the morning.